Okay, day 10 of complex PTSD from surviving to thriving. I'm reading from Pete Walker's book, and I've been doing this because it's mental health awareness month in the USA, and in the UK it's happening for a week here. So in the awareness of that many people have been through childhood abuse that's unresolved, and that as adults have a lot of anxiety, panic attacks and such like, what I'm doing is just putting information out there from a particular book that saved me, that I bought in 2017 December and started reading in 2018. And the book is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, and it's by Pete Walker. And I've been lucky enough to speak to the gentleman who wrote this book, and I feel that the information is very valid for people that maybe are having anxiety and panic attacks as adults, that have had a hard childhood, that disassociate and think that, well, it wasn't that bad and things like that. Because basically what happens if we've had a tough childhood and we're living our life in anxiety and flashbacks, there's certain things we can do that will be harmful to us. We can disassociate, we can, maybe use alcohol, or we're on meds. I'm not saying medication is bad, but I just think that we can self-medicate, and that can be a nightmare. Or we can be in codependent relationships that are not good for us. There's so many areas that we can be affected in via having complex PTSD, which is it's more serious than PTSD, and PTSD is serious enough as we know. Like, one event can change somebody's life in many, many ways. But as a child, if you've had hundreds of events where you've been through abuse or disdain or unkindness, we can think or try and play down that it was normal. But if we don't grieve it, then as adults, we will disassociate. So I'm going to read a little section from this book, and he's got here a list of the common CPTSD symptoms. So he says survivors may not experience all of these. Varying combinations are common. Factors affecting this are the 4 Fs and your childhood abuse neglect pattern. So the 4 Fs are fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And I'll be speaking about that probably in the next couple of days. I've done a slideshow that I've set up that I'm going to discuss what the 4 Fs are: the fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And what happens is we can have one or two that we overuse. And for instance, we can go into fight, like we get triggered and we'll go into fight mode or flight mode. And that needs explaining, because it may not be, the words that I'm using may not give it the definition that it really is. So he says here that the patterns, the list of common CPTSD symptoms that you can see if they apply to you in any way: emotional flashbacks, tyrannical inner and or outer critic, toxic shame, self-abandonment, social anxiety, abject feelings of loneliness and abandonment, a fragile self-esteem, attachment disorder, development arrests, relationship difficulties, radical mood facilitations. He says example, he gives an example there of something I can't pronounce, but he says, see chapter 12. Then he says disassociation via distracting activities or mental process, hair-triggered flight-fight response, oversensitivity to stressful situations, and suicidal ideation. So going on, I'm going to continue reading. And if anybody comes on and they want to say hello. Okay, let's go. He says here, a chapter on page 8, it says what you may have been misdiagnosed with. So I'm going to read this because I think it's important. He says, I once heard renowned traumatologist John Breyer quip that if CPTSD were given its due, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders used by all mental health professionals, would shrink from its dictionary like to the size of a thin pamphlet. In other words, the role of traumatized childhoods in most adult psychological disorders is enormous. If He says, I have witnessed many clients with CPTSD misdiagnosed with various anxiety and depressive disorders. Moreover, many are also and fairly inaccurately labeled with bipolar, narcissistic, codependent, autistic spectrum, and borderline disorders. This is not to say that CPTSD does not sometimes co-occur with these disorders. Further confusion also arises in the case of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, as well as the obsessive compulsive disorder, both of which are sometimes more accurately described as fixated flight responses to trauma. And he says, see below the 4 Fs, which is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. He goes on to say, this is also true, I've read that bit, also true of ADD, attention deficit disorder, and some depressive and dissociative disorders, which similarly can be more accurately described fight, flight, freeze response. So then he says, furthermore, this is not to say that those so misdiagnosed do not have issues that are similar and correlative with the disorders above. The key point is that those labels are incomplete and unnecessary shaming descriptions of what the survivor is actually afflicted with. So an example is that if you're told that you have, let's say that you've been through sexual abuse or childhood abuse and you were treated very badly and you've been really affected by it and it went on for years and years. And then as an adult, because you're having fight, flight, freeze response, you're told that you've got ADHD or you've got this or you've got that or you're BDP. It can be very, it can be very difficult to be labeled with something when basically the issue is that we've not been able to grieve what we've been through, and also that we've been put in a position where we've not had a childhood. So it means that we've not been allowed to heal and we've not been treated, we've not been with healthy regards. So, we've been really confused in childhood. So as adults, we're clearly going to have problems. Continuing reading, he says, reducing CPTSD to panic disorder is like calling food allergies chronically itchy eyes. Over-focusing treatment on the symptoms of panic in the former case and eye health in the latter does little to get to the root causes. Feelings of panic or itchiness in the eyes can be masked with medication, but all the associated problems that cause these symptoms will remain if left untreated. Moreover, most of the diagnoses mentioned above are typically treated as innate characterological defects rather than as learned maladaptions to stress, adaptions that survivors were forced to learn as traumatized children. And most importantly, because these adaptions were learned, they can be extinguished or significantly diminished and replaced with more functional adaptions to stress. So it's about learning how we manage our complex PTSD as adults. So for instance, one of the big things is the inner critic, which annihilates us and tells us that there's something wrong with us and that we're ugly or that we're stupid. And those words are generally not coming from us. Those are words that we've heard or that we've been treated in a way that we believe that is part of our conditioning. And in order to change that, we're going to have to do the mindfulness and mental work to begin to heal. So I shall continue reading. He says, in this vein, I believe that many substance and process addictions also begin as misguided maladaptions to parental abuse and abandonment. They are early adaptions that are attempts to soothe and distract from the mental, emotional, and physical pain of complex PTSD. So I'll give you an example. For years, I were used to, and I still do it a bit now, but I'm aware of what I'm doing and I'm getting better. I will check that things are off. So I'll check that the taps are off, but I won't do it once. I'll do it 3 or 4, 5 times sometimes. And then I'll check that the door's locked. So these obsessive compulsive disorders often are there to make us feel safe, because when we begin to look at what we're doing and the areas that we need to heal and work on, like OCD as an example, we can see what's really going on behind it. Is there a fear? There is a fear about safety. What's the worst can happen if we leave a tap on, like the water's going to overflow, or we leave the gas on, we're going to smell it. But when we have been through childhood trauma, we develop things that make us feel safe. It could be that we look under the bed every night, or we're checking the wardrobes, or there's so many issues that a traumatic childhood causes. And it's important that we begin to realize there's nothing wrong with us, start getting rid of the inner critic and healing that part so that we allow the other stuff to heal, and we get healthy anger, healthy blame, and also we get to verbal ventilate. So he does say, I'll read this last bit, origins of complex PTSD. He says, how do traumatically abused and or abandoned children develop complex PTSD? He says, while the origin of CPTSD is most often associated with extended periods of physical and or sexual abuse in childhood, my observations convince me that ongoing verbal and emotional abuse also causes it. Most dysfunctional parents react contemptuously to a baby or toddler's plaintive call for connection and attachment. Contempt is extremely traumatizing to a child, and at best, extremely noxious to an adult. So if you think about that, I mean, it's a very difficult one, but I've seen parents, and I'm not getting at anybody, but when a child's just having a few tears and they say, stop crying, and they say it in a really horrible tone, it's unfair. Children, particularly babies, they're sponges and they're learning. And, that if a baby's uncomfortable, then it's having a physical response to something. So we have to look as adults as well that we're not passing on our own trauma to, I haven't had children, but passing them on to our own children. And that's not about blaming adults. I think I'm being clear here. It's not about blame. It's about looking at ourselves so that we're mindful that we're not using our own trauma and then projecting it onto our children or people that we love. But this takes work. And if we're in relationship, then we need to be in relationship with people who understand our own trauma, so they are able to support us in our healing. And that can be with friends as well. So shall I finish? I'm going to finish this bit of chapter and then I'll leave it here for today. But he says, contempt is a toxic cocktail of verbal and emotional abuse, a deadly amalgam of degeneration, rage, and disgust. Rage creates fear, and disgust creates shame in the child in a way that soon teaches her to refrain from crying out, from ever asking for attention. Before long, the child gives up on seeking any kind of help or connection at all. And the child bids for bonding and acceptance is thwarted, and she is left to suffer for the frightened despair or abandonment. And also he, not just she, it's male and female. Then it says, particularly abusive parents deepen the abandonment trauma by linking corporal punishment with contempt. Slaveholders and prison guards typically use contempt and scorn to destroy their victims' self-esteem. Slaves, prisoners, and children who are made to feel worthless and powerless devolve into learned helplessness and can be controlled with far less energy and attention. Cult leaders also use contempt to shrink their followers into absolute submission after luring them into the brief phases of fake unconditional love. So we can see how also that through childhood abandonment, loss and betrayal and disdain and all the rest of it, that as adults, we can then make choices in adult relationships that just are no good for us and just a repeat of where we've come from. So it's really important we get to hone in on this inner critic. I've got quite good at it. I use the term, I told every time this inner critic came in, and it still does, maybe once a day, I tell it to bugger off. I bring myself back into myself, realize my magnitude, my worthiness of just being in a human body is just a magnificent thing. Continuing reading. He says, furthermore, CPTSD can also be caused by emotional neglect alone. This key theme is explored at length in chapter 5. If you notice you are berating yourself because of your trauma seems insignificant compared to others, please skip ahead to this chapter and resume reading here upon completion. And I'll just stop there that, I've had conversations with people where I've discussed my own trauma and childhood experiences, and people will say to me when they're discussing this, well, I didn't have it as bad as you. And I have to make it absolutely clear that as a child, any type of trauma cannot be measured, anybody's trauma cannot be measured against another's trauma. We're all human and we all have feelings. So it's important that we don't measure or berate our own trauma and say, well, I didn't have it as bad as that person, because that also happens in spirituality. Like people will say, I'm really, they're having a terrible time, and somebody might say, well, you're not having it as bad as those people in that country, or, such like. It's just such unuseful sort of comments that are made, in my opinion. Sometimes it lacks empathy. So then he says, emotional neglect also typically underlies most traumatizations that are more glaringly evident. Parents who routinely ignore or turn their backs on a child's call for attention, connection, or help abandon their child to unmanageable amounts of fear, and the child eventually gives up and succumbs to depressed, death-like feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. These types of rejection simultaneously magnify the child's fear and eventually add a coating of shame to it. Over time, this fear and shame begets a toxic inner critic that holds the child, and later the adult, totally responsible for his parents' abandonment, until he becomes his own worst enemy and descends into the bowels of CPTSD. So I think we can clearly see that getting rid of the inner critic is number one. And I'm helping people with that. And I'm also if you watch this and you know somebody who suffers from complex PTSD or has had childhood trauma and they are suffering, pass on my videos, because I want to put this message out there. I'm also doing this every night through the month of May. So please hit the notification button or subscribe. And I will add that I've got 2 lists that I'm adding below: 14 inner critic attacks that we need to be aware of, and 13 steps for managing flashbacks, both by Pete Walker. All of that's going to be below the video. And I am a practitioner, losing myself there, a practitioner in faster EFT. So I can help with the tapping to help show you how to come out of anxiety if you want me to teach you that. And also helping to recontextualize some events, because the truth is there are many events that recontextualization will take time, meaning the trauma that we've been through, we need to grieve, we need healthy anger, and we need healthy blame. But first and foremost, I think the inner critic has to be the one that we're dealing with. And that's about it for today. And I'll be back tomorrow with another video or live. That's what I'll be doing. So I'm about to sign off, and have a good Friday wherever you are, Friday evening. Thank you.